is Jerry Kroth. I'm a psych professor in California, and this is about propaganda, mass psychology in the Ukraine. Now, I've done a couple of prior lectures. One was called Propaganda and Manipulation, about how Americans are living more and more in a trance and have lost contact with reality because of mass media and advertising. Another presentation was called Why Things Are Not as Bad as They Seem. This was an expose of disaster porn and fear porn in our news, our television news. So today's presentation is about the events in the Ukraine and the level of propaganda that our mainstream media is putting out and Russian mainstream media is putting out. So it's really a very simple presentation. It's divided into two parts: what the mainstream media is telling us and what the mainstream media is not telling us. Okay, so let's start at the level of the dream. Freud called it the manifest content of the dream. So this is what is presented. This is what most people hear and what most people believe. So here's what the mainstream media is telling us. It begins in November of 2013, and President Yanukovych of the Ukraine, freely elected apparently, but a tough guy and very much in sympathy with Russia. There's a movement in the Ukraine parliament to join the European Union, and he says absolutely no way and quashes that. So protesters start gathering in the central part of Kiev called the Maidan in December, and those protests swell in January. So pretty soon it's getting to be a lot of people.
People of Ukraine, this is your moment. The free world is with you. America is with you. I am with you.
John McCain makes a visit and tells the Ukrainian people that their aspirations for democracy and going westward is something that the American people and John and the Democrats support. So as this is developing, there's more of a sympathetic portrait to the Ukrainian movement. And here is a very sympathetic kind of presentation.
I am the Ukrainian, the native of Kiev, and now I am on Maidan, on the central part of my city. I want you to know why thousands of people all over my country are on the streets. There is only one reason. We want to be free from a dictatorship. We want to be free from the politicians who work only for themselves, who are ready to shoot, to beat, to injure people just for saving their money, just for saving their houses, just to saving their power. I want these people who are here, who have dignity, who are brave, I want them to live a normal life. We are civilized people, but our governments are barbarians. That's not a Soviet Union.
So, Yanukovych is not sympathetic, and his security people shoot 110 of these protesters. And there are funerals and scenes of mourning for and pictures of the 110 peaceful protesters who were shot by Yanukovych's snipers. Yanukovych flees. He runs away. He says he's fleeing because he's afraid for his life. He goes to the eastern part of the Ukraine, ultimately ends up under the protection of Moscow and seeks refuge there. On February 24th, Alexander Turchinov issues an arrest warrant for Yanukovych for murdering 110 people. So, as this progresses, on February 28th, suddenly Russia moves into the Crimea and moves its troops and takes over the Crimea. Wow, that was fast, like 4 days later. March 12th, interim president of the Ukraine is named. His name is Arseny Yatsenyuk. They call him Yats. He is now the interim president of the Ukraine. 4 days later, voters in the Crimea decide they want to go and join Russia. They've been part of Russia historically. Most of them speak Russian, and they vote to join Russia and to be annexed by Russia. So events are taking a momentum here, and the next day the United States condemns Russia and issues sanctions against Russia for invading the Crimea. And the U.S. media is absolutely on top of this one.
And what we and our allies and partners can do is make clear that there are costs for this kind of behavior when you violate a sovereign nation's territorial integrity, when you engage in clearly provocative efforts to destabilize a sovereign nation. Those actions incur costs, and the United States...
Borders are borders, all right? So it doesn't mean anything. They illegally invaded the country, and they're going to take it, the Crimea. Go ahead.
They are violating international law. There's no doubt they are tampering and interfering. All that is true. The real peril comes when Putin and Russia say, now that Crimea has said they are independent, we are annexing Crimea and becoming part of Russia. That is an act of war. That is an act of absolute violation of every norm, every protocol, the United Nations Charter, and everything else. All bets are off.
So by April 2014, Russian separatists emerge in the eastern part of the Ukraine. And they're taking over towns and villages and basically trying to spread out to grab the Russian-speaking eastern part of the Ukraine. They're called separatists. In May, there's an election, and a man named Petro Poroshenko is elected by the Ukrainian people. The eastern part of the Ukraine does not seem to vote in this election because the Russian separatists are there, but the other sections of the Ukraine do. He wins by a popular majority, and he's a billionaire, actually. He's called the Chocolate King because he made his fortune selling chocolate. So Petro Poroshenko is now the new president. On July 17th, a Malaysian airliner carrying 298 passengers is shot down. It is thought that Russia gave high-tech... I mean, the story that is portrayed in the mainstream media is that the Russian separatists got anti-aircraft weapons from Russia and used them. They shot down a couple planes earlier, but they were military planes, and they thought they shot down another military plane, but they shot down a commercial airliner carrying 298 people from Amsterdam to Malaysia. Most of the world's leading authorities on AIDS were on that plane, or a great number of them were. Russia then removes its missiles, so says our mainstream media.
Ukraine's Interior Ministry has released this video of a vehicle transporting a Russian-made surface-to-air Buck missile unit. The ministry said the truck was presumed to be travelling in the direction of the Russian border. The Buck includes 4 missiles on a turntable mounted on a tracked vehicle. The ministry says it believes the unit may be responsible for the shooting down of the Malaysian airliner on Thursday, killing all 298 people on.
So, by August, Russia has massed troops along Ukraine's border. They still haven't crossed in. The separatists are still running affairs in the Ukraine, but there's a huge, massive buildup of Russian troops on Ukraine's borders. Now, Putin is portrayed in the mainstream media as a bully, as a thug, as an aggressor. And here's a few excerpts from mainstream American media.
This will be a catastrophe for Russia, economically and politically. So now we have Germany. We have to get France, the United Kingdom, and the United States standing united with the rest of Europe against Russia, saying, what you're doing now, Mr. Putin, it may feel good. You may be getting off your macho rocks here, saying that, look at Crimea, they have now voted independence. But I'm telling you, Mr. Putin, whatever happens with the Crimeans, we're telling you specifically, you, Mr. Putin, that this is going to be a catastrophe for you, for your oligarchs, for your system.
You have to do something.
Here's what you're going to do. And then I think Kerry has made this clear. We are going to crunch them economically. Look at these. Look at the Russian oligarchs. The guy owns the Brooklyn Nets.
Right.
You've got half of Savile Row in London. You've got those Central Park South condos going 50, 60, 70 million dollars. You tell them no visas for you guys. You Russian high rollers, you can no longer come to these free countries. You are banned.
He's done this for 15 years, and now he's reaping the rewards of the windfall. And he's going systematically, country after country, region after region. And I don't think he even anticipated he'd find somebody as weak as the Obama Kerry team to take advantage of. But he's rolled them in every way.
So it's a strange amalgam between conservatives and liberals. Liberals generally think that the Ukrainian people are aspiring for democracy and freedom from Russian dominion. Conservatives agree with that too, and they only add to that by saying that Obama's not doing enough and he's a weakling. But there's a strange agreement between left and right in the United States on the fact that Putin is a bully and a thug.
Have you met Putin? Have you ever met this guy?
No.
No.
You don't sound like you don't want to meet him.
Well, I don't want to meet him.
No.
No, listen, I just think he's a thug.
President Putin is a terrible president. He's a thug.
I mean, it's awful. Long past time to deal with this thug. He's a menace to the world, a killer who could not care less about international law or human rights.
So from the left, there's a similar theme.
President Putin's behaving like a schoolyard bully, and in my experience, I've learned unless you stand up to that bully, they ask for more and more and more, and he's always going out of his way, President Putin is, to seem to poke us in the eye.
By the end of August, actually the Ukrainian government is having some success in getting rid of the Russian separatists in the east, and that doesn't seem to please Putin. So Putin moves his troops, actual Russian troops, into the Ukraine.
Russia has invaded Ukraine. That is the unambiguous message coming from Ukraine's Interior Ministry and Ministry of Foreign Affairs amid heavy fighting in the country's east. Ukraine says regular Russian forces have crossed the border and are fighting Ukrainian soldiers. Russian tanks and columns of armored vehicles were earlier seen rolling through southeastern Ukraine. The U.S. State Department admitted that it had seen evidence of Russian regular forces operating in Ukrainian territory.
These incursions indicate a Russian-directed counteroffensive is likely underway in Donetsk and Luhansk. Clearly, that is of deep concern to us. I'll also note that we are, and I'm not sure many of you have seen this, but we're also concerned by the Russian government's unwillingness to tell the truth, even as its soldiers are found 30 miles inside Ukraine.
So on August 29th, the United States condemns Russia at the UN Security Council.
The mask is coming off. In these acts, these recent acts, we see Russia's actions for what they are, a deliberate effort to support and now fight alongside illegal separatists in another sovereign country.
Power said Russia's blatant disregard for international order would be a threat to international peace and security. She referenced the 12 countries that border Russia to urge action. Speaking at the White House, U.S. President Barack Obama also blamed the Kremlin for the escalating violence in eastern Ukraine. He said Ukrainian forces are making progress against Russian separatists and said that the U.S. and its allies are united in their opposition to Russia's actions.
Finally, I just spoke with Chancellor Merkel of Germany on the situation in Ukraine. We agree, if there was ever any doubt, that Russia is responsible for the violence in eastern Ukraine. The violence is encouraged by Russia. The separatists are trained by Russia. They are armed by Russia. They are funded by Russia. Russia has deliberately and repeatedly violated the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. And the new images of Russian forces inside Ukraine make that plain for the world to see.
So on August 30th, the next day after that speech, new sanctions are threatened by NATO, and NATO authorizes a 10,000-man rapid action force that will be deployed in Eastern Europe, not in the Ukraine, but it authorizes it. And it gives Russia an ultimatum. You either get out of the Ukraine by the end of the week, or we're going to put in new sanctions against you. So that sort of brings us up to September, and that is the story. You would say to yourself, well, what's wrong with that? Sounds like that's accurate. Okay, that is what we've been told. That's what most people believe. So what do you have to say about propaganda here? So the section part of this is what the mainstream media is not telling us. Now, I'm not a political scientist. I'm a psychologist. So we're going to be talking about psychology here. So I need to introduce how we're approaching this. Let's take a look at David Gregory's Meet the Press just for a moment, because this is mainstream media. David Gregory is considered a A-list professional journalist, and he has a Republican and a Democrat. Notice that the Republican is wearing a red tie, red state, red tie. The Democrat is wearing a blue tie, blue state, blue tie. David Gregory is wearing a blue and red tie, and he's in the center between these two. So the image that is created here is that we're giving you all sides of this question, both left and right, and we're presenting you a full, complete, balanced portrait of what's going on in the world. In reality, what is not talked about on Meet the Press is usually larger than what is talked about. So we're not operating in this mainstream theater that is has very thin margins. Okay, we are going to be talking about something entirely different. So let's talk a little psychology here. Carl Jung said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." So the process in psychotherapy, when you peel off a layer of resistance and defense, is that the person comes closer to developing reality contact and recognizing that they've been suffering under a number of delusions. You've been saying, I'm not an alcoholic. And then when they finally get to the point of recognizing they're an addict of some sort, they realize that a lot of people have been trying to tell them something, and they've been fighting it off and resisting. So this exposition that we're about to enter, we're going onto the dark side. We're not going on to what happens in Meet the Press. All right? And this is going to make liberals uncomfortable. It is going to make conservatives uncomfortable. So let us now begin our odyssey about what the mainstream media is not telling us. There's a guy named Oleg Chanibok. Never heard of him. Never saw his picture before. Never saw him on television before. Who's he? Well, we're taking our Klieg lights and we're shining it into the dark warrens of American public life. And here is a character in the dark that we don't know about. Who is Oleg? Well, Oleg is a big mover and shaker in the Ukraine. He is head of Svoboda. That means freedom. He's very virulently anti-Russian. He controls 36 seats in the new parliament, and he's the leader of that political party. And it's a major, I think it's the third largest political party in the Ukraine. And he says to his supporters, you are the ones that the Moscow Jewish mafia ruling the Ukraine fear the most. Oh, really, Oleg? That's interesting. What do you think about Mila Kunis? She is a Ukrainian actress who's in Hollywood. And he called Mila Kunis a dirty Jewess. Ooh, this is Mel Gibson drunk kind of thing we're hearing. This guy is sounding like an anti-Semite, don't you think? So his supporters wear shirts in some of the towns that they've had demonstration. And they're wearing the shirt that says "Beat the Zhids." Zhid in Ukrainian and in Russian is the worst ethnic slur that you can come up with for a Jewish person. It's roughly translated as the K word. Okay? Oleg is a total anti-Semite. Okay? And it gets worse. That's Oleg at a speech that he's given. Look at the lightning in the background. How blitzkriegish can you get? And he's doing a Nazi salute. That's Sig Heil. Oleg's doing a Sig Heil. And there's Oleg next to his friend who's doing a Sig Heil. And there are Oleg supporters doing Sig Heils. We're talking about a person who is a total anti-Semite neo-Nazi. No wonder David Gregory is not having him on the show. That's the symbol for Svoboda's political. It looks a bit like a swastika. It isn't. It's called the Wolf's Angel, and it was a symbol that was used by Nazi troops in World War II. So we have a man who is a neo-Nazi, who's on our side, or we're on his side. So there are Oleg skinheads and stormtroopers with their armbands out there on the streets of the Ukraine. Now, you might want to remind Oleg that 3 billion Ukrainians died in World War II because of Hitler. 900,000 Ukrainian Jews were murdered and exterminated by Hitler. And he is running around that country playing Nazi tunes. Well, it gets worse. There's John McCain getting ready to shake Oleg's hand. My first impression when I saw it is, do you really know who you are shaking hands with? I think he did, because later that day, he and Oleg are at a demonstration, and McCain is addressing an audience. Now, if the applause gets too loud, Oleg's going to go into a Sig Heil, and that's going to be a bad photo op for John McCain. Now, Victoria Nuland is a very major figure in all of this. She is the Assistant Secretary of State for Europe. She's there in the Ukraine, and she is smiling with the new leaders of the Ukraine, and they're all happy, except that Victoria Nuland is standing right next to a neo-Nazi anti-Semite of the first order. And they're on our side, or we're on their side. Now, Svoboda is not minor. They were given 6 cabinet posts in this new government. All right. Now, some Americans were aware of this. It certainly is not. This is a part of the story that is lopped off because it doesn't fit with the dream imagery that we're creating about Putin, the bully, the thug, and this whole scenario about the freedom-loving Ukrainian people. And there were some American demonstrators in Tampa, Florida, who said, ask Kerry why the United States backs neo-Nazis in the Ukraine. That whole part of that story has not been elucidated for Americans. Let's go to our second peeling off the layer of illusion or delusion and seeking to shed light in the darkness. This is a bit of cognitive dissonance. Part of our dream imagery is this Yanukovych. He was a mean, despotic person. He made a fortune as president. His son was worth $200 million at the time of this. Thanks, Dad. Really appreciate that. Ukraine, from the business perspective, was considered one of the most corrupt regimes to do business with in Europe. And there you see the Ukrainian people asking for help and support from the West. You see pictures in the mainstream media about the people, that the 110 protesters that Yanukovych's security personnel killed. That's the manifest content of the dream. But we haven't thought about something. If these protesters were peaceful, why did Yanukovych run away? Let's say he was afraid for his life. We haven't thought that one through in our mainstream discussion with ourselves about what's happening in the Ukraine. Well, there's a reason for that. We forgot about Oleg. Okay, Oleg's stormtroopers were also involved in these demonstrations. They wore their masks. They wore their Nazi symbols on their arms. They broke into an armory and stole weapons. They broke into the Interior Ministry and stole weapons. They were firing on Yanukovych's security personnel. They killed 18 security forces, Yanukovych's security forces. They threw their Molotov cocktails. It was a violent overthrow of the government. We lopped off that whole story about Oleg, the neo-Nazis, the violence, and even the fact that 18 of Yanukovych's troops were killed. that part has just sort of been taken away from the imagery that we are exposed to. So what do you call the violent overthrow of a government? I mean, Yanukovych's government was actually democratically elected. Corrupt, yes, but it was democratically elected, and it was overthrown by force. Well, that's called a coup d'etat, isn't it? And the government that takes over is called a junta. We do not use the term coup d'etat when we talk about the Ukraine, and we certainly don't use the term junta when our mainstream media is talking about the Ukraine. But Russia does. Russia calls it a junta and a coup d'etat. So let's go down to our third element, our third layer of peeling off and looking into the darkness. And the basic element of the dream is that we are supportive of the Ukrainian people. As John McCain said, we're with you, the Democrats are with you, I'm with you. Our hands are tied, we can't put troops on the ground, but we want you to know that we support you, and good luck on what you're doing. Okay, it's almost as if we're passively watching this from the sidelines and offering moral support. Well, Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State who is in that photograph with the neo-Nazi, she is talking on the telephone with Jeffrey Piat, ambassador to the Ukraine. Secret telephone call, recorded, posted on YouTube, not denied at all because it was so blatant. This tells a completely different story.
Right now, the top State Department official has apologized to her European counterparts after she was caught cursing the European Union, the EU, in a leaked audio recording that was posted to YouTube. The recording captured an intercepted phone conversation between the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, and Victoria Nuland, the top U.S. diplomat for Europe. Nuland expresses frustration over Europe's response to the political crisis in Ukraine using frank terms.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, you know, the EU.
Because she used a curse. There were several other very interesting parts of her conversation with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine.
Let me work on Klitschko, and if you can just keep, I think we want to try to get somebody with an international personality to come out here and help to midwife this thing. And then the other issue is some kind of outreach to Yanukovych, but we probably regroup on that tomorrow as we see how things start to fall into place.
So on that piece, Jeff, when I wrote the note, Sullivan's come back to me, VFR, saying you need Biden, and I said probably tomorrow for an attaboy and to get the deeds to stick. So Biden's willing.
That's the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Piat, speaking with Victoria Nuland. The significance of what she is saying. She also had gone to Ukraine and was feeding protesters on the front line.
Cookies. Well, here again, the American political media establishment, including the right and the left and the center, because they're all complicit in this nonsense, focused on the two sensational, they thought, aspects of that leaked conversation. She said, F the European Union. And everybody said, oh my God, she said the word. The other thing was, who leaked it? Oh, it was the Russians. Those dirty Russians leaked this conversation. But the significance is what you just played. What are they doing? The highest-ranking State Department official, who presumably represents the Obama administration, and the American ambassador in Kiev are, to put it in blunt terms, plotting a coup d'etat against the elected president.
So, there is more here, and this is a retired CIA officer talking about the same conversation.
Privately, behind the scenes, that you're cooking up a deal, and then you're saying publicly that this is up for Ukrainians to decide. Those are two totally different things.
Now, the question is, who's provoking this unrest? And you know, what I know is that you really have to stick close to the evidence. And in this case, we have incredible evidence based on an intercepted telephone conversation. And who's speaking? Well, it's the Assistant Secretary for European Affairs, Victoria Nuland, talking to the ambassador, our ambassador in Kiev. And what she's saying here, I'll just read one sentence. Yatsenyuk. He's the guy. He's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy you know, I guess, as opposed to the guy you don't know. Now, guess what? A few weeks after that, Yatsenyuk has become the interim prime minister of the Ukraine. Well, if I were a Russian, I would look at that and say, who's responsible for a lot of this? Looks like they're trying to do with the Ukraine what they did to the rest of Eastern Europe, what the U.S. pledged not to do, and that is to pluck these countries off one by one and have them join not only the European community, but NATO. The Russians are not going to stand for that. And, you know, the people advising Obama might have warned him that you go a bridge too far when you threaten strategic interests the Russians consider so sensitive as...
All right, so the essence of this is that it appears that the United States is choosing the next leader of the Ukraine. So Yatsenyuk becomes the interim prime minister, but now we have an election in May, and Petro Poroshenko takes over. Okay, that if there was an instance of American intervention, certainly now it's probably over, because this is a free election, and this is what Oleg ran in that election too. He didn't do very well, but Petro, the chocolate king, becomes the new elegant leader of the Ukraine in a free election, except the East didn't vote. So that sort of puts an end to the idea that America is meddling, right? Well, do you remember Julian Assange from WikiLeaks? He got 250,000 classified cables from the State Department and published them. We didn't like that. These are not made up things. These are real cables from the State Department, confidential cables, and we want this guy. We would like to get him back. He's been hiding in the Ecuadorian embassy in London for the last 3 years. Well, WikiLeaks actually has a document or 2 or 3 or 4 on Poroshenko. And the document says, all the way back to 2006, that Poroshenko is our Ukrainian insider. Poroshenko is our man on the inside. In other words, the president of the Ukraine is our man on the inside and has been our man on the inside since 2006. Oh, peeling off another layer. This is not making it onto Meet the Press, is it? So now there are rumors of American covert operations. Dennis Kucinich says the U.S. has been involved covertly and behind the scenes with the CIA, with the National Endowment for Democracy, and USAID to stir up trouble in the Ukraine. Really, Dennis? Or are you just a muckraker? Okay, what's the story here? Well, the story is that on April 14th, Walter Brennan, the director of the CIA, traveled to the Ukraine under an assumed name. What is the head of the CIA traveling to the Ukraine in this very, very sensitive time? This is before Poroshenko is elected. And he's having secret meetings with, with Oleg in the Ukraine. What is the head of the CIA doing in the former Soviet Union in the Ukraine, traveling under an assumed name? Well, that's denied. That's Russian propaganda. That just simply did not happen until the State Department said it did. We can confirm that the director was in Kiev as a part of a trip to Europe. What was he on vacation? So here's a little film clip about that.
And journalist Wayne Madsen says the White House earlier lied about the CIA chief's trip to Ukraine.
The White House originally lied about Brennan being in Ukraine, and so did the CIA. They said it was a flat-out lie that Brennan was in Ukraine. And then today we had the White House reverse itself and say, in fact, Brennan had been in Ukraine. Brennan met with the coup leaders in Ukraine, the junta, for lack of a better term, and was discussing with them their need to hit the secessionists in the eastern part of Ukraine. Obviously, one thing that's not on Brennan's itinerary or schedule is peace negotiations. He wants a confrontation, and it looks like he prevailed on Ukrainian leaders to get very tough with Ukrainian security forces and maybe U.S. mercenaries in eastern Ukraine.
So our fifth area of pulling the veil from our illusions, delusions, and dreams is the concept of the moral high ground and American amnesia. Dozens of columnists have talked about the moral high ground that the United States has on this issue. One columnist said that Russia's behavior in the Crimea takes us back to 19th century barbarism. That's the way countries behaved in the 19th century. It is totally backward. So let's just review a little bit about our moral high ground here.
And what we and our allies and partners can do is make clear that there are costs for this kind of behavior when you violate a sovereign nation's territorial integrity, when you engage in clearly provocative efforts to destabilize a sovereign nation.
So as we stand on this moral high ground, some people have said, wait a minute, you forgot something. You forgot about Iraq. So, and it wasn't in the 19th century, it was in the 21st century, and Crimea is connected to Russia by a bridge and has historic ties to Russia. We went 6,000 miles from our borders. We attacked the country. We overthrew the country by force. We did so on false pretenses that they had WMDs or that they had something to do with 9/11, all of which was false. And why are we forgetting that? In order to stand on the moral high ground, we have to do some very serious forgetting. Now, mainstream media pundits said, why do you have to bring up Iraq? What does that have to do with it? Well, actually, Obama took this issue on.
But even in Iraq, America sought to work within the international system.
Like, we went to the UN for a vote. We did. And then when they said no, we're like, fuck it, we'll do it anyway. Does that make us marginally better than the Russians?
So I thought maybe it would be worthwhile to try to draw out this comparison and just see where we stand. The Crimean population, 3.2 million. The Iraqi population, 32 million. The aggressor clearly against Crimea is Russia. The aggressor clearly against Iraq was the United States. The total number of people killed in the Crimea, 5. The total number of people killed in Iraq by the United States, 100,000. It's estimated that 450,000 people died in Iraq, and the number of people we killed is lower, has some estimates lower, some higher. That's the consensus estimate. References at the end of this talk. Were there sanctions against Russia for its invasion, its 19th century invasion of the Crimea? Yes. Even the thought that Obama could actually freeze some of Putin's personal assets. Any sanctions against the United States for its behavior in Iraq? No. Halliburton, no one was forbidden to deal with Halliburton. Halliburton stock quintupled during the Iraq War. So what about violations of the UN Charter? In the case of Crimea, yes. In the case of Iraq, yes. Kofi Annan was the prior Secretary General of the UN, he said that it was a criminal act and it was a violation of the UN Charter. How about the feelings of the populations, the will of the people? Well, 60% of the people in the Crimea voted for Russian annexation. But the majority of Iraqis always wanted the United States to leave. In 2005, a poll was conducted, and the majority of Iraqis wanted the United States out of the country. We ignored the will of the people. 2006, a Washington Post poll had this absolute same result. The majority of Iraqis wanted the United States out. We ignored the will of the people. In 2007, another poll, a different one in 18 provinces, had the same conclusion. We ignored the will of the Iraqi people. So if you put this together, you start to see that the moral high ground we're standing on is extremely, it's like there's an earthquake under our moral high ground. It's a very disturbed position to be in. Now, one pundit actually made a very interesting comment. He said if the United States had not done what it did in Iraq, Putin might not be doing what he's doing now. So that's certainly a comment here that it does not appear much on the mainstream media. Now there's a sixth layer of propaganda that we need to shine a light through, the geopolitical picture.
That Moscow, here, look at it through Moscow's eyes. Since the Clinton administration, the 1990s, the U.S.-led West has been on a steady march toward post-Soviet Russia. Began with the expansion of NATO in the 1990s under Clinton. Bush then further expanded NATO all the way to Russia's borders. Then came the funding of what are euphemistically called NGOs, but they are political action groups funded by the West operating inside Russia. Then came the decision to build missile defense installations along Russia's borders, allegedly against Iran, a country which has neither nuclear weapons nor any missiles to deliver them with. Then comes American military outpost in the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, which led to the War of 2008, and now the West is at the gates of Ukraine. So that's the picture, as Moscow sees it. And it's rational, it's reasonable, it's hard to deny.
So this, again, the mainstream media reacts to this kind of talk like, why do you have to bring up all these other issues? Why can't we stay focused on the Ukraine? Precisely because when we expand our horizons, we come up with a completely different understanding of how Russia sees this. So we have military bases, American and NATO bases in Poland. We have them in Lithuania. We have a military base in the central part of the old Soviet Union in Kyrgyzstan. We have 4 bases in Bulgaria. Bulgaria, what used to be the first cousin of the Soviet Union, their relationships were always close. Now they have 4 NATO bases there. We have a huge naval presence in Romania. I mean, at the time that when Gorbachev tore down that wall and he and Ronald Reagan agreed, Ronald Reagan promised Gorbachev that we would not expand eastward. Okay, that was his promise to Gorbachev. We completely violated that promise and moved straight towards the east over the next 25 years. Here are some comments from Russian television on this subject.
Says and what NATO does became most obvious in the 1990s when the military alliance started expanding eastward, despite a promise given to Moscow before the collapse of the Soviet Union.
The fact that we are ready not to place a NATO army outside of German territory gives the Soviet Union a firm security guarantee.
Fast forward 24 years.
The accession of Eastern European countries to NATO was one of the greatest success stories of our time, but the task is not yet complete.
In 1990, when the commitment was made to Moscow not to expand, 16 nations were part of NATO. Later, 12 more joined, all of them dotted close to the Russian frontier. More members could be on their way.
It's a time for all of us to stand with the Ukrainian people in support of their territorial integrity and their sovereignty, and we are doing that.
In response to the U.S. and its allies calling Russia an aggressor, a joke emerged on social media. An image of Russia encircled by NATO bases, saying, "Russia wants war. Look how close they put their country to our bases."
So there's another segment from Russia Today, and this includes some real tough talk by Victoria Nuland.
Our message to Russia is clear. NATO territory is inviolable, and we're mounting a visible deterrent to any Russian efforts to test that. We've bolstered the U.S.-Poland aviation detachment at Wask Air Force Base, and we've maintained a steady U.S. naval presence in the Black Sea. And we've also deployed a total of 750 U.S. ground troops to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Romania.
And this is not a complete list of the NATO troops in the region, and here's a closer look. Apparently, the alliance has been building up in eastern Ukraine ever since Eastern Europe ever since Ukraine was plunged into turmoil. Some of NATO's biggest members have sent dozens of fighter jets and spy planes. Reports say a guided missile cruiser is already to join a party of 2 NATO warships already stationed in the Black Sea. RT's Gaina Chachakhan examines the expansion.
Again,
The alliance is looking to deploy more forces close to Russia's borders and to get members to spend more on the military. Its key member, the U.S., which spends more on military than the countries with the next 10 highest budgets combined, is now getting a chance to boast its omnipresence.
Today, the U.S. military is engaged in nearly 100 countries, with nearly 400,000 personnel stationed or deployed around the world.
Now that we're looking at the prospect of an even larger presence of NATO forces in Eastern Europe, the UK Foreign Secretary says it is moving forward in a way that should worry Russia in the long term. Well, Russia has been worried for a while now. 24 years ago, the U.S. promised Russia not to expand NATO eastward, but since the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO added 12 Eastern European countries to the military alliance and may still be eyeing a few more.
So, Americans who watch mainstream television exclusively just do not get this picture that we have been on a steady march eastward, and we've taken 12 countries from the former Soviet Union, and the Ukraine could be our 13th. That is not a perception that is common in the United States. It is very common in Russia. Let's take a further look at number 7 here as we peel this off. The ambitions of empire, America's empire, and the Ukraine. So the United States has military contingents in over 100 countries. In the last 14 years, we have been killing people in 9 different countries: Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen with drones, Iraq, Libya, Sudan, the Philippines, the Central African Republic, Honduras. No other country can make that claim that they are involved in active military operations in that many places. Since Obama became president, we have actually built 9 new overseas military bases. So this geopolitical picture is, Americans know some of this. Our defense budget is almost equal to all the rest of the world. And that on your right, I believe it's your right, you can see the U.S. budget compared to China or to Russia. If you look at a map of the United States military installations, red, those are U.S. bases. Black, countries with which we have a military agreement. And yellow, we just about cover the globe. We have a base in the middle of the Indian Ocean, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. When you ask an American, is America an empire? 40% of Americans say no. If you ask in a poll, should America be an empire? 90% of Americans say no. But to most experts, this is the largest empire ever to have existed in a human population. So there's a thing in psychology called projection, when you accuse the other person of your own stuff that you don't want to deal with or see. So you're accusing them of your shadow, in effect. Here's a little piece that carries this message quite clearly.
U.S. against any involvement. House Intelligence Committee Chairman Mike Rogers released a statement, and it reads in part, Russia's latest action is yet another indicator that Vladimir Putin's hegemonic ambitions threaten U.S. interests and allies around the world.
So it is Putin who is trying to conquer the world and taking one country after another after another. The facts really don't justify that. If you look at almost any a measure of comparison, the David and Goliath show, the United States has 6,600 attack helicopters. Russia has 300. We have 11 aircraft carriers. Russia has 1. We have 1,000 overseas military bases. Russia has 10. And yet we're accusing Russia of hegemony on this planet. So imagine that we wake up in the morning and we've discovered that Russia has decided to build two military bases in Cuba. One military base will be an anti-missile defense system like we have in Poland. And some people are, well, if you have an anti-missile base, how do we know that that is not a base where you could launch cruise missiles, offensive cruise missiles with nuclear warheads? And then Russia announces it's starting a military base in Nicaragua and another one in Venezuela. What do you think Bill O'Reilly and Geraldo would say about that? Would they say, well, it's none of our business? Or would they just be up in arms at Russia's aggressive move into our backyard? I'm sure it would be the latter. Well, that's exactly how Russia sees this, and it is not how America sees the events in the Ukraine. We are focused only on the Ukraine, and we are not dealing with these so-called extraneous other factors. So, in effect, Vladimir Putin is saying, he said on a telephone call to Barack Obama, if you press a spring too hard, it will recoil. Well, what does he mean by that? He means that you guys are opening military bases all over the world. You are not decreasing your defense budgets. You're picking off former Warsaw Bloc countries one by one. You've got 12. You're shooting for 13 in the Ukraine. And the Ukraine is not right on our borders. It's a sister republic. And we are drawing a line in the sand, a red line in the sand. Sorry. Okay? And when Putin says that, the Russian people are absolutely resonating with him. His popularity rating in Russia is 87%. Okay? 9 out of 10 Russians say this American aggression has to stop. We have had enough of your encroachment. It must come to an end. Here's a comment by Putin.
Этих граждан. Мы считаем и будем считать, что Украина наш не только ближайший сосед, а действительно наша братская республика, соседняя.
So this perception does not come across in our media much. We much prefer seeing him as a thug, a killer, as an aggressor. But to Russia, they are holding their line. This is Stalingrad. This is enough. We are not going to take any more of your push eastward. So let's take a look at our 8th layer, attempting to shine a light in the darkness, and that is disguised American priorities and special interests. Here is the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation.
Pleasure to introduce to you the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, Victoria Nuland. Victoria just recently returned from Kiev and has an update on the situation there, as well as the U.S. government position. Victoria?
So Victoria Nuland appears now, and she's talking to an entity, but on the right is a sign that says Chevron. On the left is a sign that says Exxon. Interesting.
Aspirations. We've invested over $5 billion to assist Ukraine in these and other goals that will ensure a secure and prosperous and democratic Ukraine.
Okay, so she said we invested $5 billion in this enterprise. So I wonder if we could have a short digression to the city of Detroit just for a moment. Okay, we're coming right back to this. So Detroit asked African-American President Barack Obama, who cut his teeth as a community organizer in the inner cities of Chicago, and Detroit is in a state of post-apocalyptic explosion in a sense. And they asked for a bailout, and Obama said, no, but we'll give you $300 million to knock down a few more houses. So here are some stats about the state of Detroit. There are 78,000 abandoned homes in Detroit today. 30% of Detroit is either vacant or derelict. Less than half of Detroit's residents over the age of 16 are working. If somebody breaks into your house and you call 911 and they have a gun to my head, it takes the police an hour to respond to a 911 call in the city of Detroit. 40% of Detroit's streetlights do not work. 2/3 of Detroit's parks have been closed. Half of their schools. The murder rate in Detroit is 11 times higher than in New York City. Only 10% of crimes in Detroit are solved. Now, in that context, Detroit gets $1, Ukraine gets $16. Detroit gets $300 million, the Ukraine gets $5 billion. Now, I'm from California, and we have a little bit of participatory democracy here, so we have propositions. You can vote on capital punishment every once in a while or to reduce your property taxes. Imagine the American people given a vote to let Detroit go and to invest in our enterprise in helping the Ukraine come into NATO and to the European Union. Do you really believe the American people would prioritize the Ukraine 16 times higher than they would prioritize Detroit? It makes almost no sense at all, especially that this is happening under an African American president. So you think to yourself, there must be something going on behind the scenes. After all, who is sponsoring that talk? Chevron and Exxon? Well. There is indeed a background, a backdrop that is really never reaches into American consciousness. The United States and EU energy companies want to buy a 49% interest in Ukraine's transport system. Gas. Russia sells gas to the EU, and it goes through pipes in the Ukraine. And now the United States and Chevron will own the transport system? Do you think Putin is going to go for that? So if he wants to sell gas to the Ukraine, he has to get Chevron's permission? Monsanto has an interest in introducing GM corn into the Ukraine. GM foods are not allowed in the European Union, but Monsanto is encouraged that that's going to end soon. And they have a plan for a large plant in the Ukraine, in the new Ukraine. Chevron has an interest in Ukrainian shale gas. But probably most of all, Exxon had an interest in developing the Skifska gas field off the Crimean coast that holds 250 billion cubic feet of natural gas. They had an interest in that until Putin annexed the Crimea. So there are special interests who really have an interest in what's going on. And in fact, Victoria Nuland is almost bragging that we have spent $5 billion. I think translated that means we have put in $5 billion to forward your interests. Chevron, Exxon, and Monsanto. So we've now taken off 8 layers from what our mainstream media is not telling us. And it does have an impact on how confident we are in the mainstream narrative that Putin is a killer, Putin is a thug, this is a democratic revolution. There's something wrong with that. It's at best a half-truth. So this is a psychological enterprise. That's what we're doing. We're trying to shed light on the dark aspects of American public life. And we've completed that part of this segment here. But if you were not a psychologist, you would say, oh, you're just saying America is bad and Russia is good. Well, I can see how you can come up with that conclusion. So let's talk for a moment about the other side of this, Russia's media propaganda, because they have a great deal of it too. Let's start with the first layer that we'll pull off of Russian media propaganda. There is a billboard in Russia that shows the Ukraine with a huge swastika stamped on it. There's another billboard that says, "Stop fascism in the Ukraine." Well, all right, fine. There is a neo-Nazi fascist group in the Ukraine, but they only got a few percentage points in the last election. There are millions of Ukrainians who are not fascists, who are not swastika-bearing stormtroopers, who are peaceful, who want a future with the West, who have democratic aspirations. Aren't you kind of exaggerating one aspect of this and lopping off a part of the story too? Just the way the American media lops off a part of the story?
Reinforcements into Ukraine, and the answer is that Putin is trapped by his own propaganda. Vladimir Putin created this monster, which people are very frightened of in Russia, because he controls Russian TV and he controls what goes on Russian TV, of Nazi Ukraine. Every day on television, for 12 hours a day, Russians have been told that Ukraine is now run by the Nazis, that they're a
All right, so we have our first layer here of Russian propaganda. So a second event here, where we look at Russian propaganda, is the treatment of the Malaysian airliner. They have really never been that forthcoming in setting out the Western theory of what happened. First, they said that the Ukrainian government shot that plane down, but the Ukrainian government did not have the technology to hit a plane at that altitude. Then they said that a Ukrainian fighter pilot had confessed to shooting down the plane from his fighter plane, and just to embarrass the Russians. And they quoted the Malaysian Straits Times newspaper. Trouble is, the Malaysian Straits Times newspaper said, we never ever said that. Okay. Then there was a rumor that the Malaysian airliner was filled with corpses, and it crashed there. That's in the blogosphere. So that's ridiculous. Did they shoot all the major AIDS workers who were going to a conference and dress them up in suits and then put them on the plane? So the idea, the most logical and rational interpretation of this is that Russia gave highly sophisticated weapons to the separatists who made a mistake. They thought they shot down another Ukrainian military transport, and they shot down a civilian airliner. That's the most likely truth that the Russians have not really been that exposed to. The Russians, during the spring and summer, kept saying there are no Russians involved in this, but there were Russian soldiers who were captured by the Ukrainians inside of Russia, who were aiding and abetting and fighting alongside the Russian separatists. In fact, the head of the Russian separatists admitted that 3,000 to 4,000 Russians, actual Russians, were fighting with the separatists during this period of time. That was concealed from the Russian public. Also, there were that Russia Today is kind of the close to the Kremlin news program, which we see in the United States. And one of their main anchors took an issue with how the Russian government was asking Russia Today to treat the Russian invasion of the Crimea. And she came out on record and said that this is not true. Another anchor for Russia Today actually resigned on air.
Last night, RT made international headlines, and one of our anchors went on the record and said Russian intervention in Crimea is wrong. And indeed, as a reporter on this network, I face many ethical and moral challenges, especially me personally, coming from a family whose my grandparents came here as refugees during the Hungarian Revolution, ironically to escape the Soviet forces. And that is why, personally, I cannot be part of a network funded by the Russian government that whitewashes the actions of Putin. I'm proud to be an American and believe in disseminating the truth. And that is why, after this newscast, I'm resigning.
So that was kind of a dramatic moment. There are more on the internet in Russia and in the press. There are a whole series of falsifications that have been cropping up. Here are a few of them. This is a picture of a girl crying next to her dead mother, saying this has occurred in the Ukraine, thanks to the Ukrainian junta. Actually, that's a photograph from a feature film. This is a photograph of a Ukrainian tank, and if you look closely on the left, you'll see a swastika on that tank. But the Reuters photograph shows the same scene except there's no swastika. Somebody is using Photoshop here. I think this appeared on the internet. This is another story that appeared in Russia, that Ukraine is burning down wheat fields and going to start a famine in the Ukraine. Those wheat fields were actually photographed years earlier when Russia was experiencing a drought. Here they say that cluster bombs were being dropped in Donetsk, where the Russian separatists are, and there's an example of a cluster bomb. Actually, that very picture was dropped by an Israeli warplane in Lebanon in 2006. This is a woman. Here's a picture of a woman in the Ukraine crying over standing next to a dead child. That's actually a photograph that appeared in 1995 in Chechnya. This is a photograph of a demonstration in the Ukraine. Actually, it's a demonstration in Poland. This is a photograph of Ukrainian refugees leaving the Ukraine and coming to Russia for safety. Actually, the same picture is a picture of refugees from Kosovo. So there are propaganda blind spots on both sides, obviously. So the strange thing here is that most Americans have swallowed the mainstream point of view pretty thoroughly and truly believe that Putin is the aggressor, of the thug, an international pariah, and in some cases a vampire and bloodthirsty killer. Russians are equally convinced that America is aggressing against them, that they have manipulated the situation, they have overthrown the government of the Ukraine by force, they are trying to add the 13th jewel to their crown with the other 12 countries they've gotten, and it is time to stop American aggression. So we have delusions, half-truths, influencing over 450 million people. Americans are generally unaware that their CIA director snuck into the Ukraine using a fictional name and was wheeling and dealing along with Victoria Nuland in choosing the leaders of the Ukraine. This is not a concept that fits the mainstream story. Most Russians are unaware of the fact that there are thousands, millions of people in the Ukraine who are not Nazis and fascists, who have participated in the government and who have democratic ideals. So there's a book that I wrote called Duped: Delusion, Denial, and the End of the American Dream. And many of the references from this talk are found there if you haven't found them in this talk. So what is reality if both populations are living with half-truths and are suffering delusions of one degree or another? That is the majority of these populations suffering from this. What is the actual truth? What is reality? Outside of all of the propaganda, well, actually, the reality is quite disappointing, okay? That's the Ukraine. The pink areas of the Ukraine speak Russian in the main. The darker areas speak Russian almost exclusively. The yellow areas, only 5% of the people speak Russian. This is a country that is linguistically divided, all right? So we almost have two countries here, which are split not quite down the middle. Now, what is the truth? What do the Ukrainian people really want? How many Ukrainians really want to join the EU? Well, 39% of Ukrainians would like to join the EU and go west, and 37% are absolutely opposed to it. The rest are, I guess, ambivalent, but that's a poll. In other words, neither side is going to be happy with these results. Okay, this is not the wish of the vast majority of Ukrainians, either way you look at it. So we need to come down off of our propaganda that we have created to examine what is actually the case. So the question is, how does this whole story end? I mean, most people believe that what will happen is that there will be some kind of negotiated settlement. Angela Merkel speaks Russian. She knows Putin. They do not want to lose their gas supplies for this winter. They're reluctant to put heavy sanctions on Russia. So perhaps the Russian separatist movement, the eastern part of the Ukraine, either will become highly federated or have some autonomy or be able to join Russia, and the other part might go westward, and there will be guarantees that there will be no NATO bases in the Ukraine. That is a guarantee that Obama and NATO have not been willing to give. But if that comes out, that might slow Putin down a bit. That is the most likely scenario. But there are others who say the situation is far more dangerous than that.
It's a very dangerous situation. We're probably closer to a war between great powers, which would be a thermonuclear war, than we've ever been since the Cuba crisis.
A heavy hit.
I don't want to disturb your listeners who are going to go to bed after watching you, but I think we're 3 steps from war with Russia.
That's kind of scary. But that is not the majority opinion of people, even outside the mainstream media. There's a moment here where we need, as psychologists, recognizing that we have a patient here whose contact with reality is marginal. And then we have another patient over here whose contact with reality is marginal. Well, there's certain danger when it comes to having people who have marginal reality contact. So what we need to do, in part, is to follow the dictum of George Santayana, who said, if you don't remember history, you're the first to repeat it. We have to recognize that we may have a lot more attack helicopters and overseas military bases than Russia, but the level of nuclear weaponry is relatively equal between these. We still have 2 nuclear superpowers who are involved in this, and we need to be cautious. We need to have collective cautiousness, if you will. Let's go to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Do you remember that part of history? The Russians are coming, the Americans are blockading, and Khrushchev backs down and leaves. And everybody praises President Kennedy for a very rational approach to this problem. And dozens of books are written over the next 40 years. But there's a conference held in Cuba in 2002. Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense under Kennedy, was still alive. He went to it. So did everybody else. Robert McNamara was absolutely shocked at what he learned in Havana. He learned that everything we knew about the Cuban Missile Crisis was wrong. The Russians were coming with submarines that were carrying nuclear weapons. We didn't know they had nuclear weapons. They were carrying nuclear-tipped torpedoes. And Kennedy and McNamara dropped depth charges on them to force them to the surface. He learned that the United States dropped depth charges on a nuclear submarine carrying nuclear weapons. And that's what he did. And he was shocked that he did that. That we were that stupid to do that. So aboard the ship, the commander, Savitsky, said, "We have standing orders. We are under attack. We need to fire our torpedoes." Fire. A junior officer named Vasily Arkhipov argued and said, if you do this, you could start World War III. We need to surface, okay? Now, McNamara did not know that for 40 years. Noam Chomsky said, we were 1 word away from annihilation. If Savitsky prevailed and said fire, that would have destroyed the American Navy, and the United States would have retaliated against Russia in seconds, and Russia would have retaliated against the United States in seconds. Within 2 hours, both societies would be devastated, and the Northern Hemisphere would probably be plunged into a nuclear winter. Vasily Arkhipov saved the world by being facile with his words and convincing Savitsky not to fire that weapon. So what are we supposed to learn from history? We're supposed to learn that we're kind of stupid. Robert McNamara was brilliant. John F. Kennedy was brilliant. And they almost destroyed the world with their stupidity. They did not know what they were doing. Okay, so in this present crisis, we think things will resolve. We think things will be, there will be compromises. But from history, we learned that we came close to destroying a large part of the human race, and we did not know what we did for 40 years. So we live in a state where two states are engaging in propaganda. The United States is portraying Putin as a bully, a thug, an aggressor, a 19th century barbarian. The Russians are absolutely convinced that the United States is the aggressor, has picked up 12 countries in Eastern Europe, and has been engaged in these underground covert machinations to topple the government of the Ukraine, put in its own people, put in Poroshenko, put in a fascist, and that America must be stopped. And we're coming like closer and closer to some kind of a confrontation, okay, which we think will resolve naturally. But if we take from Carl Jung said that we don't have enough attention paid to the unconscious, okay? The unconscious is filled with issues related to demonizing, to darkness, to projection, to scapegoating, that this propaganda that we're seeing in both populations effectively incites unconscious predispositions towards impulsivity, towards portraying the other as demonic, as satanic, as a vampire, as a thug, as a thief, as an aggressor, as a barbarian, as an archetypal evil swastika-bearing Hitler. Okay, and the populations are absorbing these images in a way that incites collective hysteria, collective panic, mass psychology, herd behavior. And the only weapon against this, says Jung, is consciousness. The only weapon against our dark side and this insightful propaganda is consciousness, and throwing light on the dark side of what is not being talked about in both societies, which is what the intent of this is and has been. So let us hope that we do not repeat history, and that both societies start to recognize other things that they're not looking at and that are in the darkness for both populations. Thank you very much for watching.